Hello, and welcome to Real Cheating Story. Peter sat in shock as he listened to his fiancée finish her statement. His anger surged through him. Pete had been driving to the show for their regular day out when he asked Polly if she wanted to take a week and go camping with him after her college classes ended next month. Polly replied, "Pete, you know I am leaving the day after classes are over. Shelley, Emma, and I already have almost everything packed. We're ready to go. You know we're taking the whole summer for a trip out west." "Polly, if you think they'll just let that happen, you're mistaken. I thought when we decided to get married, you agreed not to go on this trip. What changed your mind?" "Oh, Peter, I never said that. You know we've been planning this trip ever since we started college. We've been saving every penny we could to pay for it, but we'll still have to work some during the trip unless we find someone to help cover the costs. Do you know how hard it was to cut expenses and stretch our budget so our parents would give us more money to save for this?" Peter, feeling betrayed, responded, "Polly, I know how your two friends act when they're away from home. I also know how they manage to cover their expenses when they can't pay for everything themselves. I've had bad feelings about them ever since you started those girls' nights out. I don't want you going out alone with them here, and I certainly don't want you spending the entire summer with them." Polly was furious. "How dare you talk about my friends like that? I won't let you insult them. You knew from the start that I was going on this trip, and nothing has changed. You go on your short military reserve trips, and I trust you. Why can't you trust me the same way?" "Polly, it's different. I'm a reservist. When I'm called up, I'm on active duty doing my job. I don't have time to think about anything else. But if you take this trip, we won't last. Even if you're not planning to do anything wrong, you'll be in situations where things can happen, and I won't be there. This trip could ruin us, and I won't just stand by and let that happen. Is that what you want? Are you trying to break up with me?" "No, Peter, of course not. You're my main man, and after this trip, we'll be even closer. We'll travel together and see the country. I'll come back, and everything will be fine. You'll always be the one for me." Peter's voice hardened. "Polly, I had better be your only man. If you go on this trip, you won't be my woman anymore. I can't accept you spending the summer like that and then expecting everything to stay the same." Polly tried to ease the tension. "Oh, Peter, don't be silly. I told you. I'll come home, and we'll be together. I don't want to argue about it anymore." The rest of the evening was a blur in Peter's mind. They had gone to the movies as planned, but he couldn't remember a thing about the film or their conversation. His thoughts were consumed by Polly, her friends, and her insistence on going on the trip. He recalled some of her remarks from the past year, things that now felt selfish and dismissive toward him. Before he knew it, the credits were rolling, and the theater was emptying. Polly stood and took his hand, but they didn't stop for a snack or drink afterward like they usually did. Peter took Polly straight home, walked her to the door, and turned to leave. Polly grabbed his arm, confused. "Pete, what's wrong? We didn't stop for supper, and now you're just leaving me here? Aren't you coming in like you always do? I was really looking forward to spending more time together tonight." "No, Polly," Peter said firmly. "I'm not coming in, and I don't know when I will again. You need to decide what you want because I can't keep doing this. But I'll tell you this. If you go on that trip with your friends, you won't see me in your house again. Think about that." Peter turned to walk away, and Polly reached for him again but missed. She took a few steps after him, calling out, "Pete, you didn't even kiss me goodnight. Why are you being like this?" She glared at him as he opened his truck door, looking back at her one last time. "Fine, go ahead and sulk. I'm taking that trip, and that's final. When I get back, we can set the wedding date. Just stop acting like this." Polly turned and was closing the door to her house before Pete drove off. She looked up at her two best friends, who were watching her with grins on their faces. Emma said, "I guess he didn't take it too well, huh?" Polly shook her head and smiled. "No, but he'll get over it. He always does when I put my foot down. Besides, he knows he can't find another girl like me." She laughed and added, "Of course, if I ever found out he was being unfaithful, I'd regret it for a long time." Shelley laughed and asked, "And how is that attitude fair?" Polly snapped back playfully, "Oh, shut up. You know I don't share my man with anyone." Emma laughed, teasing, "You shared Jared with me Wednesday night." "That was different," Polly replied, grinning. Peter's my man, and I won't share him. I'm not concerned about anyone else. He's the only one I'm serious about. The conversation shifted as Polly asked, So, where are we making our first stop on the trip? I'm thinking maybe Butte or Bozeman, Montana. I feel like having some fun before we dive into anything serious again. Pete didn't call or visit Polly again before she left on the trip with her friends. The day after their planned departure, he drove to Polly's apartment to confirm that she had indeed left. The apartment was empty. He then went to her parents' house to check if she was there. Even though he didn't want to spend the money on gas, he felt the need to physically verify her absence. It wasn't too far, just over 100 miles, and his little four-cylinder truck was fuel-efficient enough that it wouldn't cost too much. Besides confirming that Polly had actually left, Pete also wanted to return the personal belongings she had left in his apartment. He had no intention of seeing her again, and certainly didn't want her things lingering around his place. When he arrived at Polly's home, her father confirmed that she had left for the trip as planned. From their conversation, Pete realized that Mr. Parker wasn't too happy with Polly's decision either. It took them about 15 minutes to move Polly's belongings into the house and stack the boxes in her bedroom. After shaking hands with her father, Pete drove back to his now lonelier apartment. Pete was 2 years older than Polly, but a year behind her in college. He had just finished his associate degree in construction management and planned to get a bachelor's degree in project management. His long-term goal was to start his own construction firm after gaining a few years of experience. In addition to his studies, Pete was also a staff sergeant in a National Guard engineering company. Between his part-time jobs, the GI Bill, and his reserve pay, he had managed to get this far in college without taking on any debt. He lived in a modest apartment, but he was proud to pay his own way. Pete didn't have close family or savings to fall back on. His parents had passed away, and their construction company went bankrupt after their accident. The only thing Pete inherited from his father's side of the family was a small 80-acre plot of land in the country left to him by his grandparents. The land had no house, just an old building used for storing a few pieces of outdated machinery. When Pete visited the property, he would camp out in the machine shed or by a stream near a cave. After returning from Polly's parents' home, Pete decided to terminate his apartment lease. He moved all his belongings to his piece of land and started living there, camping out and reflecting on what had happened. He still attended his National Guard Reserve meetings and summer training, but otherwise, he stayed on his little farm. At first, Pete spent his time lounging around, fishing, swimming, and feeling sorry for himself. This pity party lasted about a week before he snapped out of it and resumed his exercise routine. As a staff sergeant, he needed to stay in shape to perform his duties properly. After 3 weeks of living this simple life, Pete grew restless. He wandered into the old machine shed and looked at the equipment stored there. He knew the old tractor would still start. He'd used it often enough to clear brush and grass around the property. It was still early enough in the season to plow some ground and plant a late crop of soybeans. He knew he'd have to hire someone to harvest them, but it would give him something to do and maybe even make a little extra money. Pete hooked up his plow and headed for the field. He had only made a few passes when one of his neighbors pulled up and stopped. The neighbor got out of his truck and watched Pete work for a while before walking over. When Pete stopped the tractor to talk, the man asked, "Why are you plowing?" These days, most people just spray to kill the weeds and use no-till planting in the crops. It saves time and money, adds humus to the soil, protects against erosion, and helps retain moisture. With the way the weeds are out there, I could loan you my machinery if you want. Just remember, if you break it, you have to pay to fix it. Well, I don't know, Mr. Jeffers. I haven't done no-till before, so I wouldn't know how to start, Pete replied. Mr. Jeffers chuckled. Well, with the weeds that tall, you should probably bush hog first. Then use Roundup to spray and kill the grass and weeds. After that, you can use my no-till drill like you would your old drill to plant the beans. Make sure to get Roundup Ready seed so you can spray again once they come up and you're all set. If you decide to do corn or wheat next year, you can do it the same way. Pete thought about Mr. Jeffers' advice the rest of the evening. It would definitely save him a lot of time and fuel to try no-till planting. He decided to give it a shot. He had an old spray rig he thought he could get working, and he knew his bush hog would still function since he used it often enough during the warmer months. Early the next morning, Pete began cutting the field with his small equipment. It took him 4 days to finish, but he stayed committed. Once he was done, he hooked up his disc to smooth out the area he had plowed. Then he went to the neighbors to ask about borrowing the no-till planter. He had already purchased the seed for his crop. When Pete drove up to Mr. Jeffers' house, he found him working in his machine shed on a tall, heavy-duty drill. Pete grinned as he got out of his truck. He walked up to Mr. Jeffers and extended his hand for a shake. "Good morning, Mr. Jeffers. If you're still willing to loan me your no-till drill, I'd like to take you up on it. I want to no-till my beans this season and see if it's better and cheaper than planting the old-fashioned way." "I guarantee it's a lot easier and cheaper to no-till," Mr. Jeffers replied. "And please call me Dan. You're all grown up now and a man in your own right. We're neighbors and friends, so no need for the formalities. I hear you're a sergeant in the reserves, too. Want me to call you Sergeant?" Pete laughed. "No way. I'm not a sergeant out here. I guess I am, but since you're not in the military, I'd prefer you just call me Pete." "Fair enough. Now let's get this drill over to your place and get you started. I'll help you hook it up and show you how to use it. I'll stick around a while to make sure you're set." Even with the late start, Pete only took part of 2 days to get the beans drilled. He made sure to clean up the drill before returning it to Stan. His next task was to find the funds for fertilizer and get it spread on the field. Before doing that, he took several soil samples across the field and brought them to the county agent for testing to determine the right mix of fertilizer and lime to apply. To his relief, he found that he didn't need to apply any lime, just a small amount of fertilizer. He purchased the fertilizer at the local co-op and used one of their spreaders to apply it to his field. After almost 2 weeks of hard work under the sun, Pete finally found a moment to sit in front of his cave and relax. He was proud of what he had accomplished and looked forward to harvesting a cash crop in the fall. As he sat back, he listened to the small stream running down the hillside beside his cave and could hear cattle lowing in the distance, along with the sound of machinery working in one of the neighboring fields. In this peaceful setting, Pete's mind wandered to Polly. He couldn't help but wonder what she was up to and whether she was enjoying herself as much as he suspected she would. That thought gnawed at him. He knew he might never find out what she did during her trip unless she or one of her friends let something slip. He still wasn't sure how he would feel when she returned. Part of him thought their relationship was over, but there was a small chance it might not be. He needed to reflect on it all. His main issue was trust. He remembered how wild Polly and her friends could get when they were drinking and dancing. They often flirted with men, and Pete felt uneasy about that. During his time on deployment, he had heard rumors about Polly spending time with other men. Twice, while he was away, he was informed that she had been seen out with different guys, looking far too friendly. A friend even sent him a letter detailing Polly's escapades, including a not-so-flattering picture. Another friend claimed to have seen her being overly affectionate with multiple men while he was stationed in Afghanistan. When Pete asked Polly about the rumors, she always denied them. He chose to accept her explanations, but couldn't shake the doubts lingering in his mind. He knew the friends who reported these things were not fond of Polly and likely only shared the worst of her actions. Still, where there's smoke, there's fire. He was nearly certain Polly had at least crossed some lines, even if she hadn't fully cheated. After reflecting while enjoying a few beers, Pete came to a conclusion about his relationship with Polly. He just didn't trust her anymore. He wasn't even sure he still loved her. If he truly loved her, the pain of what he perceived as her cheating and taking that trip would have hurt more. Deep down, he realized he was uncertain about whether she loved him either. She certainly didn't seem to respect him, based on her actions and cutting remarks. Pete decided it was time to move on. He would not search for Polly when she returned. He had no intention of revisiting any of their old haunts, so the likelihood of running into her by chance was slim. He had only brought her to his farm once, and he believed she wouldn't be able to find him here, even if she looked for him. If she did reach out, he would play their reunion by ear, but he knew it would be a challenge for her to win him back. As the summer progressed, Pete continued to work around his little place. If he wasn't busy with the reserves, he was on the farm. He converted a garage bay and his machine shed into a small workshop for his machinery. He plowed and planted a small garden to grow some of his food for the summer. Right now, he was sleeping in the cave where it was cool, but he knew he needed to figure out his living situation for the winter. If he went back to college, he would need to rent an apartment. If not, he needed to decide where to live during the cold months. One day, as Pete contemplated school, he felt tired of classes. He was content on his little farm and enjoyed his short tours with the reserves. He decided he wouldn't be returning to college in the fall. His thoughts then turned to winter living. He didn't want to venture into town to find a rental, as that would require finding a job, which he really didn't want to do. This meant he needed to figure out how to make his place snug enough to withstand the winter on the farm. Pete considered cobbling something together in the machine shed, but he preferred the cave's location. It was high enough above the stream that he didn't have to worry about floods, and he enjoyed the beautiful view from the front of the cave. He decided to use some old concrete blocks and stones to build a wall across the front of the cave. He had already installed electricity, one of the first things he did after inheriting the farm from his grandparents, running lines 150 feet from the machine shed so he could have lights in the evenings. The cave's opening was approximately 30 by 15 or 20 feet, with a height of about 10 feet. He figured he could gather enough stone and blocks to wall it off easily. The floor wasn't perfectly level, but he could even it out with a little concrete in strategic spots. Early the next morning, he went to town and made the necessary purchases to get started. He ordered sand and gravel for the concrete and mortar, and took home cement along with some building materials. He also ordered a steel door for the front, 2 triple-pane PVC windows, lumber, and metal roofing for a covered porch. Pete chuckled to himself, realizing he couldn't really call this a true cave. It was more like a large, overhanging bluff, only about 30 feet deep, with the back 6 or 8 feet too low to stand in. Pete planned to close off the rear of his home, where the wall would be 6 feet tall, and he would add another steel door for access to the back area, which he could use for storage if needed. The next day, when his building materials were delivered, Pete wasted no time. After laying out his proposed walls, he began hammering drill holes into the rock and placing rebar. He formed and poured concrete to level the area for the stone wall and the cave floor. Once that was setting up, he measured and poured a stem wall for his little porch. Luckily, the drop-off in front of the cave required only a wall 30 inches high at its highest point. After the concrete was dry enough to remove the forms, he filled in under the porch floor with river gravel and mixed and poured concrete for a 30 by 12-foot porch in front of his cave home. All this work took him a week to complete, which would have taken even longer without the front-end loader on his small 45-horsepower tractor. On the day Pete began pouring the concrete for the porch floor, his neighbor across the small stream started cutting hay in the field. When Pete took a break, he watched the tractor go around and around, impressed by how quickly the hay was being cut. He couldn't recall ever seeing the man on the tractor before and wondered if it was a custom operator or hired help. That afternoon, after the field was cut, the tractor drove to the stream and stopped just across from where Pete was working. The operator got off the tractor and limped toward the stream. As they walked, they removed their shirt. When they reached the stream, the operator stopped to take off their shoes and then dropped their long pants. Pete stared in surprise. The tractor operator was a very pretty woman. She glanced over at Pete for a moment before stepping into the stream and immersing herself in a small, deep hole. The deep part of the stream, where she was trying to swim, wasn't really large enough for swimming. It was about 12 feet across and 15 feet long at its deepest point, chest high in the center and shallower elsewhere. After she got completely wet, the woman lay on her back and floated in the cool water. Pete found himself watching instead of working. Finally, shaking his head slightly, he turned back to his tasks. For the next 30 minutes, Pete mixed concrete in his small electric mixer and poured it onto his new porch floor, estimating he needed 3 or 4 more mixers full to finish for the day. He then heard movement and a voice call out, "Hello, I'm Fiona Morgan. I know it's none of my business, but what the heck are you doing to the old cave here?" Pete replied, "Nice to meet you. I'm Pete Johnson. I've decided to turn the front part of the cave into my home. I'm pouring the front porch right now. I really need to keep working until I get the concrete poured. I'm not being rude, but I can't let it dry too much, or it won't set up right." "That's cool. I always liked playing around in the cave when I was a kid. Mind if I look around for a minute or two?" "Go ahead. I'm almost finished here. After I clean up, I might jump in the creek myself. Clothes on, of course," Pete replied with a grin. Fiona turned and looked at him. Seeing his smile, she said, "Well, I hope so. I'd hate to have to use my official U.S. Army combat training on you." "You're in the Army?" Pete asked. "I'm a staff sergeant in the reserves. I've been in for a little over 6 years now." "What's your MOS?" Pete inquired. "I'm not in the Army anymore. I guess you noticed I don't walk like I should. Sergeant Fiona Morgan, U.S. Army retired, would be more accurate for me. I was a medic and got a little banged up on a mission. They patched me up, but as you can see, I can't get around as well as I need to. So they put me out to pasture. Now I'm helping my parents on the farm while I try to figure out what I want to do with my life. I never had much interest in college, and there aren't many jobs around here, so I'm just helping them until I decide what to do. I might go for my EMT certificate and try to get on with the ambulance district. I enjoyed being a medic. How about you?" "Pretty much the same," Pete replied. "I'm a staff sergeant in the reserves. I've been deployed twice, and I take all the short tours I can. I plan to make the reserves my career. I got my AA degree at the junior college, but I don't want to pursue further education. This 80 acres was my grandpa's, and I inherited it when he passed away. I was lucky he lived longer than my dad. Everything my parents had went to pay their bills after they died in a car wreck. What you see here is all I have in the world, and I'm fine with that. I plan to live here, grow whatever I can on the farm, and take all the short tours I can from the reserves before retiring." "Just you and your little piece of ground? Don't you ever plan to get married or anything?" Fiona asked. Pete laughed and said, "Well, I was planning on getting married and doing the whole 9 to 5 thing, but she decided she wanted to run around with her friends instead of with me, so we split. She's somewhere out west now, probably enjoying herself. Yeah, it would be nice to have someone, but it's not a high priority for me right now. If I find someone, then we'll see what happens." Pete and Fiona chatted for several more minutes. She even shared one of his beers before sighing and saying she needed to get back home to help with chores. As she walked off, she said, "I'll see you around, I suppose, Sergeant. I hope you don't mind if I come by now and then to soak in the creek." "No, it wouldn't matter if I did. It's your creek too. Your family's land borders the south side, so you have just as much right to swim in it as I do," Pete grinned. "Besides, I like the view when you're washing off the dust. It might be good if you made a little noise when you come down, though. I've been known to swim without anything on." Fiona turned and grinned back at Pete. "I've been known to do that too, but that was years ago before I figured out that all you men are just waiting to pounce on us poor defenseless naked women. I might just sneak up on you, though. I could enjoy the view." She laughed and said, "Catch you later, Pete." 2 days later, Fiona returned. This time, she was raking hay into windrows in preparation for baling. After completing that hot, dusty job, she drove down beside the stream and changed into a bathing suit. By then, Pete had finished the short wall in the back of his cave and was working on the front wall. He watched her off and on as she worked, and after using the mortar he had prepared, he put his tools in a water bath and walked over to the stream where Fiona was floating. He took off his shoes and waded into the stream, carrying a pool noodle. Once he was in the deepest part, he floated on the noodle and said, "Afternoon, Fiona. Mind if I join you for a while?" Fiona smiled and replied, "Not at all. How's it going, Pete?" The two young people visited for several minutes, but then Pete decided he needed to return to work. He invited Fiona up for another beer before she left. Those 2 days seemed to set a precedent for the rest of the week. After finishing her day's work in the field, Fiona would meet Pete at the swimming hole, and they would talk. After her swim, she would come to Pete's place, enjoy a beer or two with him, and admire the work he had accomplished while she had been away. Pete's little home took shape rapidly. Inside the cave, he had a 2-room setup, and he even managed to pipe in water from the old well and set up a bathroom inside. He faced quite a challenge breaking through enough rock to install the water and drain lines deep enough to prevent freezing, but he was proud of his accomplishments. The room under the natural rock measured 24 by 15 feet. He placed his bed in the far rear of the small room, built a kitchen area on one side of the front, and created a sitting area on the other. His bathroom was tucked behind the kitchen area. He was also pleased to have installed a small wood stove for winter heat, all for about $3,700 in building materials. After the hay was harvested, Pete did not see Fiona as often as before, but she still came to the swimming hole at least twice a week throughout the hot part of the year. To his surprise, Pete found himself looking forward to seeing her and felt disappointed when she didn't show up. Finally, on a Wednesday while they were floating in the stream and enjoying a beer, Pete mustered the courage to ask her out. Fiona looked at Pete in shock when he made the invitation. "You're kidding, right?" she asked, her surprise evident. Pete felt a bit hurt by her reaction. "No, I wasn't joking. I was serious, but if you don't want to go, that's fine. I just thought we could have some fun." "I'm sorry I suggested it," he added, trying to mask his disappointment. Seeing the hurt in Pete's face, Fiona quickly explained, "Hey, I didn't mean to upset you. I was just surprised. You've never given me any indication that you thought of me as anything more than a beer-drinking buddy. Besides, I'm a wounded soldier. I can't dance and have trouble walking. I haven't had a date since my injury, and you just surprised me. Okay, if I didn't totally upset you, yes, I would like to go out with you." Pete smiled, relieved. "Great, but you've got it all wrong, Fiona. You may be a wounded soldier with scars, but anyone who can't see what a great person you are doesn't deserve a date with you. I enjoy being with you. I don't care about the scars. I never liked dancing anyway." Pete was not the most observant person, but he didn't notice how Fiona's eyes and face lit up when he told her he enjoyed her for her personality and inner beauty rather than her exterior. His words made her heart flutter, and she could tell from his tone that he meant every word. She felt her spirits lift higher than they had been since her injury. Although she wasn't in love with Pete yet, she was definitely on her way there. After that moment, Pete and Fiona continued to date and visit back and forth throughout the long winter. She was amazed at how cozy his little home under the cliff was and enjoyed every moment spent with Pete. One spring day, they were back at Pete's home, sitting on the front porch and watching a typical spring thunderstorm. As the wind began to blow harder and the sky darkened ominously, they heard a loud roar, and the porch roof began rattling. Pete watched in amazement as the roof flexed. The rain came down almost sideways, blowing across the porch. Once he realized what was happening, he grabbed Fiona and started pulling her toward the front door. "Tornado! Come on, hurry. We need to get inside for protection." Without stopping, they entered the main room of his little home, where Pete pulled Fiona to the back and into the small room he used for storage. They closed the door and sat on the floor. After closing the door, they could barely hear the roaring of the storm. Soon, a crash of breaking glass interrupted the chaos, and an eerie quiet descended on Pete's farm. After about 10 minutes, Pete opened the door, allowing Fiona to follow him outside. One of the front windows had shattered, and part of the porch roof had been thrown through it. Rain and debris had blown into the room, leaving Pete's bed damp but not terribly wet. The porch roof was gone, torn away by the wind. Stepping into the now softly falling rain, Pete looked toward his machine shed, which was also gone. Some of the roof had fallen onto his machinery, and many of the beautiful trees around his home were damaged, some even uprooted. Fiona came up to Pete and wrapped her arm around his waist, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Oh, Pete, I am so sorry. Come on, let's see what the damage is." They first walked toward the shed. As they turned around the corner of the bluff where the cave was, they saw both their trucks. There was some damage from debris hitting them, and Fiona's front windshield was cracked and starred from a hit in the center by something large and heavy. Both vehicles appeared to be operable, although Fiona's truck was not legal to drive with the damaged windshield. They continued on to the damaged machine shed. Much of Pete's machinery was bent and damaged from the building collapsing onto it before blowing away. Some smaller pieces were rolled around the barnyard. He would have to clear the wreckage before he could determine if any equipment was inoperable, and he had a lot of trees to cut and storm damage to repair. However, it was obvious that this had not been a terribly strong tornado. Pete's machine shed had been blown down more than blown away. Sure, some of the metal siding and roofing was completely gone, but much of the building was lying on top of the machinery stored inside. Fiona and Pete walked up onto the top of the bluff over the cave home to observe the storm's path. Fiona gasped and grabbed Pete's arm. "Pete, it looks like the storm hit our farm. The house and barns are all damaged. I have to get home and check on Mom and Dad." She took off running, or hobbling, as fast as she could toward her truck. Pete ran to catch up with her. When Pete reached Fiona, she was trying to get into her truck, but he grabbed her and held her back. "Wait, Fiona. You can hardly see out of your front window. Come on, let's get my chainsaw and some other tools, and grab the first aid kit. We'll take my truck." Pete and Fiona rummaged around in his broken-down shed until they found the chainsaw, fuel, and oil, as well as some ropes, chains, a come-along, and a couple of heavy steel bars for prying. They then drove out of his lane as fast as they safely could and turned toward Fiona's home. Twice, they had to stop to cut trees from the road before they could proceed, which slowed them down. It took them nearly 45 minutes to drive the 2 miles to her home. They could have gone through the fields, but they would have had to cut one of the fences. When they arrived at Fiona's home, they saw that the house and outbuildings were destroyed, similar to Pete's machine shed. However, the buildings were more blown down than blown away. Fiona ran frantically around, screaming for her parents. Finally, she and Pete heard a muted yell coming from within the wreckage of the house. Pete backed his truck as close as he could, and they began clearing wreckage from the area where the noise was coming from. Fiona was crying as she frantically worked to clear the debris. A large tree was lying over one corner of the house. After they managed to cut the tree away, Pete saw a broken cellar door partly covering the steps leading down into the cellar beneath the house. The yelling was coming from the cellar. They finished clearing the door and Fiona rushed down the stairs, calling for her parents. Pete followed her, carrying a flashlight. When he got to the bottom of the stairs, he saw Fiona hugging her father and mother tightly. Pete walked up to Fiona and wrapped his arm around her waist to comfort her as well. After the initial relief of finding each other safe, Fiona's father, Seth, began to walk out of the cellar. When he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped and looked around their farm in shock. Fiona and her mother stood on either side of him, each wrapping an arm around his waist. Pete walked up beside them, standing in silence for a moment as they all took in the devastation. After a few moments, they began to walk around, surveying the damage. The rain was picking up again, and Pete said, "Look, folks, it's getting dark and the rain is starting again. Why don't we all go to my place for the night? We can decide what we need to do in the morning and get started on rebuilding. My place isn't fancy or comfortable, but at least it will be dry and warm. I'll put something over the broken window, and we can build a fire to stay cozy." The next morning, Fiona and her mother prepared breakfast on Pete's small wood stove. While they ate, the 4 friends discussed how to recover from the disaster. Pete insisted that Fiona and her parents stay with him until they could set something up for themselves. After breakfast, Seth, Bridget, and Fiona returned to their place in Fiona's truck while Pete went to town to purchase replacement materials for the broken window and porch roof. He also turned in his losses to his insurance agent, who promised to have an adjuster out in the next day or 2. Pete was instructed not to begin rebuilding until after the adjuster had been there, but he was allowed to replace the window to safeguard his home from further damage. Pete also mentioned the damage at the Morgan place, as they were insured through the same agent. He promised to have the adjuster visit them the same day. After returning home with the replacement window, Pete spent the rest of the morning installing it. After that, he worked on his machine shed until he could get his tractor out. Some of the sheet metal was bent on the tractor, but it was otherwise undamaged. Now he was thankful he let the insurance agent talk him into getting a policy that covered his equipment, as well as the machine shed and his little shack of a home. Just before dark, Fiona and her father came back to Pete's place with a mattress, refrigerator, bedding, and clothing for everyone. They also brought preserved food in the truck. Bridget had taken the family truck to town to buy groceries. They had managed to get a generator running and plugged the deep freeze in to keep their frozen food cold. Pete also got his generator out to run his electric appliances until the power company could restore service. The news broadcast indicated it would probably be later the next day before service would be restored in their area. The next 10 days were hectic. The insurance adjuster was there, and Pete was awarded $100,000 to rebuild his machine shed and 2 smaller outbuildings. He was also to receive $155,000 for the damage to his machinery and $7,500 for the damage to his small home. Much of the settlement was for labor to rebuild. However, most of that would be pure profit for Pete because he intended to do almost all the work himself. With that kind of money coming to him, he decided to increase the size of his home to include a 12 by 30-foot porch. He planned to add a new porch surrounding 3 sides of the building. Although it would take more than the $7,500 he received for the damage to the house, he was committed to the project. He would use the cave portion of the home for a bedroom and the new addition for living, kitchen, and office space. He even intended to build a larger bathroom just inside the cave with access from the new addition and his bedroom. Pete got busy digging the footings for his new porch 2 days after receiving the promise of the amounts he would get from the insurance adjuster. He used scrap materials from the blown-down buildings for the formwork. He had the concrete poured and was ready to begin the construction by the time he received his check for the damages. He explained his plans to Fiona and her family, and they were all supportive of his ideas. Pete decided to use concrete for the walls of his new house and cover the outside with stone. He hated to spend the money but figured it was a worthy investment. If he ever faced another tornado, it would make the house easier to heat and cool as well. The concrete would cost about $2,500 if he did the work himself and bought ready mix, so he could do it all in one pour. Having worked with concrete several times in the military, he knew how to handle it. He would need to rent the equipment, but that cost would be negligible. After having the concrete poured, he was waiting for it to cure enough to remove the forms and begin putting the roof on his new addition when his plans went awry. He received the all-too-familiar phone call from his reserve unit. Once again, his unit was being called to active duty for service in Afghanistan. He would be gone for a year. While he liked the financial benefits this would bring him, he hated the thought of leaving his farm in its current state. When Pete told Fiona and her parents that evening that he was being called to active duty once more, Fiona exclaimed in dismay and rushed to him for a hug. Pete quickly assured the 3 Morgans that they were more than welcome to continue living in his home until they could rebuild their own. They had completed the cleanup of their house site and were waiting for a company to come in and build a steel structure that would then be turned into a new home for the family. In the meantime, they continued to work the farm and clean up the damaged outbuildings. The night before Pete left, much to his surprise, Fiona came to his room in the middle of the night. He woke up when he felt her slip into bed with him. She greeted him with a passionate kiss, and before he knew it, she was pulling him closer. He gently pushed her back slightly and said, "Fiona, we can't do this now. Your parents are sleeping nearby and will hear us for sure." While this wouldn't be the first time Pete and Fiona had been intimate, he still felt uneasy about doing so with her parents so close by. However, Fiona was determined. She gave him an intense kiss and whispered, "I don't care. My mother knows we're together, and I'm sure my dad does too. I want to spend one last full night with you before you leave, and I intend to make the most of it." They tried to be as quiet as possible, but when Fiona reached her peak, she made enough noise that both her parents surely heard. Afterward, the 2 of them drifted off to sleep and didn't wake until Bridget was preparing breakfast. When she saw Pete rising from his bed, she poured 3 cups of coffee and placed them on the small table, grinning when a very sheepish Pete walked up to get his coffee. He couldn't bring himself to look her in the eyes. Bridget took pity on him and said, "I wondered why you 2 weren't sleeping together before this. I know how you feel about each other, Pete. It's fine with Seth and me. Fiona is a grown woman, and if she wants to spend the night with her partner, a man we all think highly of, then we have nothing to say about it." Finally, the day arrived for Pete to report to his unit. All 3 of the Morgans watched as he drove off to war once again. Fiona would pick up his truck after his unit deployed and return it to his farm. He had added her name to his checking account so she could pay his bills while he was gone. She and her father would farm his small acreage during his deployment. The first 3 days at the reserve center were typical for a unit mobilization. There was paperwork, and more paperwork. There were also last-minute loadouts of equipment that had to be shipped overseas with them. Much of the larger equipment they would use was already in theater, as was a significant portion of their smaller equipment that had been shipped out earlier. On departure day, to Pete's surprise, Fiona showed up with her parents to see him onto the bus. Many things were covered at the mobilization station. Medical and dental checks were done on all deploying soldiers, personnel files were updated, and there were legal briefings, along with concentrated training and weapons qualification. During this deployment, Pete made use of the legal update and created a will leaving all his belongings to Fiona. He never told her about his decision. After 3 weeks at the mobilization station, Pete's unit of combat engineers was loaded onto aircraft and flown to Kazakhstan for a short acclimatization period before moving into the country to relieve the engineer unit they were replacing. This replacement took place over a 30-day period, after which Pete's unit was solely responsible for engineer functions in their assigned area, supporting local Allied and U.S. forces. Pete's unit arrived at the beginning of the local summer, and by midsummer, he was enduring temperatures of 130 degrees Fahrenheit. It was miserably dry and dusty, and they worked long days and many nights, doing everything an engineer unit does. They performed route clearance, built schools, roads, and other structures, often facing enemy fire while being overworked. Pete had mixed feelings about it. He both loved and hated the experience. Many days, he took the opportunity to call home and talk to Fiona, and their conversations gradually deepened. As they approached the halfway mark of their deployment, disaster struck. The unit was working on a road in the mountains when they came under attack. After almost 30 minutes of intense fighting, Pete's platoon sergeant was hit, and as the next senior sergeant, Pete found himself thrust into the role. He quickly adapted to the situation, just as he became aware of the location of all platoon members when the platoon leader was also struck down. Now, Pete was in charge of what remained of the engineer platoon, fighting for their lives. Noticing a decrease in the level of fire in one sector he was responsible for, Pete led a counterattack against the terrorists. He and 13 of his remaining soldiers moved into the breach, systematically working down the line of attackers. The support he had requested finally arrived, and the attack helicopters concentrated their fire in support of him and his men. Within 10 minutes of their counterattack, the terrorists began to retreat in defeat. By the time reinforcements arrived, all that was left was mopping up and treating the wounded before evacuation. After this action, Pete found himself not only gifted and highly competent in combat, but also a superb platoon sergeant in all aspects of his job. By the time he returned home, he had been promoted to platoon sergeant, E7, and awarded the Bronze Star for his leadership during the attack. Finally, the day all deployed reservists longed for arrived. They were replaced and returned to the United States, where their unit was demobilized. As has become customary in many towns when their National Guard or Reserve unit returns from deployment, Pete's unit was met by throngs of happy friends and family. To Pete's surprise, Fiona threw herself into his arms when he made his way into the crowd, hoping to find his truck waiting for him so he could return to his small farm and relaxing surroundings. Pete almost stumbled when Fiona wrapped her legs around his hips and her arms around his chest. "Oh, Pete, I've missed you so much. I'm so happy you're home," she exclaimed. "Come on, I've got your truck. What do you want to do first? It's almost noon, and I'd really like to get some good food. What they served us was fine, but I want to hit all my favorite restaurants as soon as I can. I've missed pizza and good steaks more than anything. Right now, though, I'd love to have a pizza from the House of Pizza. It was one of my favorite places when I was in college here in town, and I've dreamed of one of their homemade pizzas almost since we got to Afghanistan. After that, I just want to go home and sleep for 24 hours, then eat some more." When they arrived at the House of Pizza, they took Pete's favorite table. He and Fiona were chatting and holding hands across the table when a very pregnant waitress walked up. She pulled her order pad from her pocket and turned to take their order, but when she saw Pete, she dropped her pad and turned pale. "Pete, oh my God, I've been looking all over for you. Where have you been? It's so good to see you again. I've really missed you." She leaned down, trying to hug him, but Pete jumped back to avoid her attempt. It had been over 2 years since they broke up, and she was the last person on his mind. "Hello, Polly," he said, glancing at her pregnant belly. "I see you found another boyfriend. Or is that a result of your running around with the friends you call skanks?" Polly left in tears and disappeared into the kitchen. Soon after, another waitress approached their table, requesting their order in a surly manner. Pete felt a twinge of unease, worried that they might do something to the pizza that would make it unsafe to eat. He remembered that Polly had a history of acting out in anger. Looking at Fiona, he said, "You know, I think maybe we should just leave. I've lost my appetite after talking with your friend in there." Without a word, Fiona stood up and waited for Pete to follow. She stepped closer and gave him a quick kiss. "Honey, I have to use the restroom before we go. It'll just be a minute. The waitress glared at Fiona, then stomped back into the kitchen. Pete stood by the front door, waiting for Fiona. After a few minutes, he heard raised voices coming from the back of the restaurant. He moved to see down the hallway and spotted Fiona and Polly facing each other, their expressions tense. Pete walked toward the women, and halfway across the floor, he heard Polly say, "I still want to know what you're doing with my fiancé. You little crippled up. I heard his unit was called up, but now that he's back, I intend to marry him, so you need to just back off." Fiona laughed and replied, "He wouldn't marry you after what you've done to him, even if you were his last chance for matrimony. I can't believe you were so foolish to leave him for your friends for a summer. I know he promised you that if you did that, he would never be your man again. What's the matter? Need a dad for your little one?" When you saw Pete, did you think you could talk him into taking that role? I wonder if this is the only one you've got. Or maybe you found another one on your little escapade. Now, I suggest you just trot back into the kitchen and hide or get back to work. My man and I are leaving, and before I go, I want to leave you with some advice. I'm a retired Army sergeant, and I know how to handle situations like this. I guarantee you don't want to make me angry. It would really bother me if I thought you were trying to steal my man. You had your chance, and you blew it. Now get over it and find another one." Fiona turned and walked toward Pete. When she reached him, she blushed slightly and wrapped her arm around his. "I'm sorry you heard that, Pete. I hope you don't think I'm overstepping my boundaries. Can we find something to eat and then get home? I really want to get out of this town." When Pete turned down the lane to his house, he noticed Fiona seemed unusually animated, almost bouncing in her seat. Her expression was a mix of excitement and anxiety. Just before they came into sight of his yard, he asked, "What's the matter with you? Why are you looking so nervous all of a sudden?" "Well, you know how you gave me the authority to write checks on your account to pay your bills while you were gone? I sort of spent a lot of your money, and now I'm afraid you might be a little upset about it. Dad and Mom thought it was a good idea, and I guess we just talked each other into doing it. I'm sorry if I did wrong." Pete was watching Fiona, trying to determine what she might have done that would upset him. As he approached his usual parking spot, he finally registered what he was seeing. His house was finished. It had a roof, a covered porch on 3 sides, and was beautifully landscaped with flower beds and shrubs. His machine shed had been rebuilt and was even slightly larger than before. He stopped the truck, staring at his little farm in shock. His stomach clenched. From the looks of it, Fiona must have spent everything he received from the insurance, and perhaps a little more. Turning to her, Pete felt anger rising and fought to keep his voice civil. "Fiona, it looks like you spent my whole insurance check, and maybe even some of the Army pay that was deposited in my accounts. You knew I planned to do the work myself and save some of the money. I didn't want to spend everything on labor. I wanted to upgrade my machinery too." Fiona interrupted him, her voice earnest. "No, Pete, I didn't do that. I only did what you said you wanted for the house and the machine shed. I didn't pay a dime for labor. Everything here was done by Dad, Mom, and I, along with some friends and neighbors. A lot of the neighbors pitched in to help our local hero. Come on, I want to show you. I know you'll like it. Please don't get upset until you see it." Fiona pushed Pete toward his truck door, and once they were outside, she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the house. She rushed to the door and waited for him to enter the room built on the slab that had been his old front porch. She walked to his desk, pulled out his bank book, and handed it to him, then turned on the computer. Once it booted, she loaded Quicken and showed him a report of all the expenses for the rebuilding she had authorized. Pete was shocked at the balance shown in his accounts. Fiona had only spent about half of what he had estimated it would cost to do the work himself. He sat in his desk chair, clicking through several accounts and pages of reports, then turned to Fiona. "How did you do that? You only spent a little over half what I thought materials would cost to finish the job." Fiona smiled. "Well, I sort of worked a deal with some of the suppliers. We got a lot of the materials at dealer cost or a deep discount because of your service. We told the dealers you were deployed in Afghanistan and that we were rebuilding your farm buildings that were damaged in the tornado before you left. They gave us some really great deals when we explained that labor was being donated as a thank you for our local hero. Sometimes, they even donated items or substituted more expensive materials than we ordered." Fiona looked at a shocked Pete and held her hand out to him. Come on, honey. I want you to see the machine shed and shop we built for you, too. I promised Mom and Dad we would come to their house for supper. Pete followed Fiona around his yard and machine shed, still in shock. It was exactly as he had described it when telling her about his plans, and in some cases, it was even better. Fiona and her crew had even installed compressed air lines in several strategic places in the shed. There was a pit in the floor for him to work under machinery if needed, and the pit could be covered for safety when not in use. After they finished in the new machine shed, Fiona led Pete outside and pointed out that they had even cleaned up the damaged trees from the tornado. She showed him a new shed built behind his house where all the firewood had been stored out of the weather. Pete was reeling in shock when Fiona led him back into his house and showed him his bedroom. Inside, she gently pushed the door closed and turned to Pete, moving closer to him. She wrapped her arms around him and kissed him softly. At first, it was gentle, then it became more intense as they embraced. Pete felt Fiona's warmth against him, and they shared a moment of connection. As they pulled away, Pete lay back with a sigh and pulled her close to him. Fiona rested her head on his shoulder and wrapped her leg around his thigh. Looking at Pete, she whispered, "I've missed you so much. I love you, Pete. I was so worried about you while you were over there." Pete moved his head slightly and gave Fiona a gentle kiss. "I love you too, Fiona. After being with you, I know I never loved Polly. I don't think I even knew what love was until I met you. I love just being with you, sitting quietly, working, or just enjoying each other's company. Anything I do with you is better than anything I do without you or with others." After a short nap, Pete rose from his bed and quietly moved out of the bedroom without waking Fiona. He went to the refrigerator, found his favorite drink, and stepped out onto the front porch. Taking a seat in his new porch chairs, he looked over the stream at the Morgan's hay field while he sipped his drink. Pete sat quietly, listening to the sounds of his home. In the background, cattle lowed, a dog barked, and a rooster crowed. One of the neighbors was operating a tractor, and all of this blended with the gentle sound of the spring running down the hill beside his home on its way to join the larger stream near the swimming hole. He hadn't even thought about the fact that he was still in his pajamas. He was home, and he was comfortable. He heard the door open and turned to see Fiona come out of the house, looking radiant. He was captivated by her presence. "You are so beautiful, Fiona," he said quietly. "God, I love you." Fiona smiled, feeling emotional. "No, I'm not. I have scars now, but I love you for saying that." Pete wrapped his arm around her and pulled her gently closer. "Yes, you are beautiful, Fiona. You're all woman and put together perfectly. I'm really getting tired of you complaining about your scars. Even with those marks, you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen. They just add to your beauty. They show your inner strength and dedication to those in your care. They reflect the kind of woman you are, and I love you all the more for them. Now, why don't you sit here with me for a while? I want to relax and enjoy the peace and quiet until I finish this drink, then we'll go to your folks' place." During the trip to Fiona's parents' farm, Pete reconnected with his home area. He was saddened by the devastation still apparent from the tornado. Trees were horribly disfigured. Many still lay in tangled piles, rotting away. It was painful to see nature so damaged. Pete knew it was nature's way, but it still hurt. When they drove into the yard at Fiona's parents' home, he was impressed. While he could still see the destruction from the tornado, the farm was recovering. The barns were rebuilt, and the house had been restored. The trees that remained had been trimmed and were showing new growth. He thought the house looked strange, a metal box with a roof and a small porch over the door. He missed the older, well-maintained two-story house that the tornado had blown down. Pete was met in the yard by Seth and Bridget. Seth stood back grinning while Bridget wrapped Pete in a hug. After she stepped back, Seth stepped in and shook Pete's hand. "Welcome home, Sergeant. We're all glad you made it back safely. Now maybe these womenfolk of mine will quit worrying so much about you and get a full night's sleep for a change." After a wonderful meal, the four friends sat in the yard visiting as night fell. Finally, around 9 p.m., Pete was about to pass out from exhaustion. "It's great being here with you all, but I'm just dead. I need to get home and sleep for about a week. Thank you for the wonderful meal and the nice welcome home." Pete stood to shake Seth's hand, and when he stepped back, Bridget wrapped him in another hug. "Now you don't stay away, Pete. We want you to come back real soon." To Pete's surprise, she gave him a quick kiss on the cheek before stepping back, her eyes glistening. Pete smiled, then turned to walk toward his truck. Fiona hugged her mother and father, then moved to catch up with Pete, wrapping her arm around him and leaning her head on his shoulder. When they got to his truck, he opened the door and pulled Fiona close for a kiss. She stepped back and began to climb into his truck, and he watched her with surprise on his face. "Fiona, what are you doing?" he asked. Fiona looked worried and upset. "Pete, I'm going with you, honey. If you don't want me, I'll understand, but I want to be with you. Please." "I told Mom and Dad I was going with you." Pete paused, gathering his thoughts. "Fiona, you know I love you, but is this really what you want? I would love to take you back home with me tonight. Nothing would please me more than to have you move in with me, but we have to think about what it would mean for your reputation here. What will your parents think? What will the neighbors think? Worse, what will everyone say? And how will they treat you if you do this? I want you to be with me more than I've ever wanted to be with a woman, but I want it to be right for you too." Fiona smiled at Pete and said, "Pete, this is right. I knew before you left that I loved you fully and completely. I wanted to have this conversation before we got here tonight, but we got busy, and I never found the way to ask. I told Polly today you were my man. I meant that. I love you and want to spend time with you if you'll have me. I want to spend what's left of my life with you. I feel complete and serene when you're with me. When we are apart, I feel like part of me is missing. I know I'm not perfect, but I'll try to be everything you want me to be." Pete looked at Fiona for a long moment before getting into the truck without a word. After closing the door, he looked up toward the house. Seth and Bridget stood watching from where they could see the truck. Seth had his arm around Bridget's shoulder, and when they saw Pete looking at them, they both raised their hands and waved. Bridget turned slightly toward Seth, wrapped her other arm around him, and laid her head on his chest. Pete started his truck and drove down the Morgans' driveway. He stopped at the road to check for oncoming traffic, then turned toward his home. As he started moving, Fiona scooted closer to him and rested her head on his shoulder, placing her hand on his thigh as she looked up at him. When they arrived at Pete's house, they walked arm in arm to the front door. Pete opened the door and let Fiona enter before him. She turned on the overhead light, and he looked at her for a moment before moving to his duffel bag resting on the couch, where he had dropped it earlier that afternoon. He began pulling things from the bag and tossing them onto the floor. Finally, at the bottom, he pulled out a pair of combat boots. Turning the right boot upside down, he shook it until a small box fell into his other hand. He dropped the boot and walked over to a puzzled Fiona, opening the box to reveal a ring. "Fiona, I love you," he said. "I've told you that several times. I wanted to do this soon but was hoping for a special moment. Since you're staying here with me, we should make it official. Fiona, will you marry me?" Fiona pressed her lips together, nodding her head as she held out her left hand, which was shaking slightly. Her face glowed as Pete slid the ring slowly onto her finger. After he let her hand go, she wrapped him in her arms and whispered, "Yes, Pete Johnson, I'll marry you. I've wanted to spend my life with you almost from the first time I met you. You're the first person who has treated me normally since I was injured. I fell in love with you for that, and because you treated me like an equal. My love for you grew when I realized you cared about what I thought and listened to what I said. You treat me like a friend, a partner, and yet you make me feel cherished. I love you for all you are, and for the way you treat me." Fiona smiled and continued, "Now let's get cleaned up and then get you to bed. We have to go over to Dad's tomorrow and show off my ring and pick up more of my clothes." Pete looked at Fiona while he processed what she had just said. "More of your clothes?" he asked. Fiona blushed and nodded, saying, "I hope you don't mind, but I've been spending a lot of my time here. I feel more comfortable here than at Dad's new house, so I brought some of my clothes so I would have them when I needed them." Pete laughed and finished undressing before pushing Fiona toward the shower with him. They took a quick but enjoyable shower together. Afterward, they stumbled toward the bed, feeling excited and happy. The next morning, as dawn broke, they woke in the same position, still uncovered. Pete had to use the bathroom badly, so he carefully moved out from under Fiona to head to the restroom. Once finished, He walked back into the bedroom only to find Fiona missing. He wandered into the main part of the house and found her in the kitchen preparing coffee. Fiona looked up at Pete and smiled. "Why don't you go out on the porch and enjoy the morning while I finish the coffee, honey? I'll bring you a cup when it's ready." Pete did as she suggested, sitting on the porch and watching the sun rise over the trees. Rays of light pierced through the fog rising from the stream, and he felt relaxed listening to the sounds of the neighbors' livestock and the birds. To his surprise, Fiona walked up and handed him his coffee, smiling as she sat down in a chair beside him, facing him. She teased him with her playful demeanor, looking into his eyes. After taking a sip of her coffee, she smiled and said, "See anything you like here, soldier?" Pete grinned and replied, "Oh yeah. I've really missed looking over the stream and your folks' hayfield." Fiona looked shocked for a moment before grinning back and teasing, "Well, I ought to go in and get dressed. That would teach you a lesson." No need to do that," Pete said. "I see plenty of other things worth looking at now that you mention it." Fiona laughed and said, "I think we need to drink our coffee and reconnect before breakfast." After sharing a hearty breakfast of biscuits, ham, eggs, and hash browns, along with more coffee, Fiona quickly loaded the dishwasher before they put on their outer clothes and headed for her parents' home. They arrived just as Seth and Bridget were sitting down to lunch. Bridget looked up when the young couple walked into the kitchen, jumped up, and began setting 2 more places at the table for them. Fiona looked guilty and said, "Don't do that, Mama. We just finished breakfast about 15 minutes ago. Neither one of us is hungry." "Fiona Morgan, whatever were you doing that made Pete wait until noon for breakfast? I thought I raised you better than that." Seth snorted and then laughed. Bridget turned to glare at him, but she quickly blushed and looked hurriedly toward Fiona, who was covered in a deep blush. Her mouth dropped open in shock, and she too turned deep red. "Oh," she whispered. Rapidly turning back to her lunch, Fiona moved to the cabinet, took out 2 glasses, and filled them with iced tea. She walked up to Pete and handed him one. Before stepping back, she gave him a quick, gentle kiss. She sat at the table beside her mother and stuck her left hand out over her mother's plate. Bridget looked down at the hand and squealed. She grabbed Fiona's hand to steady it while examining the engagement ring. After her parents finished lunch, Fiona helped her mother clear the table and wash the dishes. Seth took Pete outside to sit in the yard and chat while Fiona and her mother worked. Later, Pete and Fiona took a load of her belongings back to his home. As they left that day, they continued to work on his little 80-acre farm. He stayed in the reserves, and they also helped with the work on Fiona's parents' farm. As the years progressed, they took over the complete operation of both farms. After their second child was born, the 2 families traded homes, and Seth and Bridget lived in Pete's old cave home until they both passed away. Pete retired from the USAR after 40 years as a command sergeant major, and his and Fiona's youngest son continued to operate the combined farms. In their later years, Pete and Fiona moved back into the cave home and let their son and his family have the larger main house. Throughout his life, Pete made and kept 3 major promises. He promised Polly that if she left to play around, he would never be in her bed again. He promised to love, honor, and cherish Fiona until death did them part, which he fulfilled. And he promised her father that he would care for his daughter, which he did. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share,